Good morning, everyone. My name is Martha Greene, and I want to welcome you who are here today and online today as well. And we are, as you know, continuing through this series on the Lord's Prayer and crossing the line of difference. Well, last week, Pastor Aaron spoke about the phrase that begins with Our Father, and he also helped us to see that for some people who have had difficult or painful relationships with their father, that there are other names for God that can be used. And today we're going to be talking a lot about names, both in the phrase, hallowed be thy name, or holy is your name, as well as the story of Jacob, who receives a new name when he wrestles a mysterious intruder or a man by the river Jabbok and receives this new name. So what's in a name anyway? Juliet asked Romeo that question in Shakespeare's famous play. She asked him because they had two different last names which made their families enemies. Montague and Capulet, names that meant rivalry and prejudice, violence, animosity. But Juliet was trying to say to Romeo that those last names don't matter. They just don't matter at all. And those of you who know this play know that names do matter, because the rival family names resulted ultimately in the two lovers' death, along with three others. Names matter. I want to begin by asking you a question that I asked all of our staff members last Tuesday. I asked them, how many of you like your name? And then I asked them a different question. How many of you don't like your name? Now, you don't have to raise your hand. It's your turn. How many of you do like your name? Raise your hands. How many of you don't like your name? What I have found, there's a story behind everyone who doesn't like their name. Well, about 3/4 of the staff liked their names. Many were named after a dear relative or friend or after the country of their ancestors. Some were named after biblical figures. But the ones who were not crazy about their name had some amazing, even painful experiences related to their name. One of our staff members actually changed her name. But the person who really sticks out in my mind is the person who, at the time of her delivery, mom gives birth to the baby and dad insists on naming the baby after his ex-girlfriend. Go figure. Well, in ancient Israel, names were given a lot of thought and were of utmost importance for both God and humans. And when children were born, their names weren't arbitrarily or thoughtlessly chosen, and they were filled with meaning. And this applied to both humans and to God. In the Hebrew Scriptures, name was inextricably bound up with existence. In fact, nothing had existence without a name. So to cut off and never say a name again was to literally end the existence of the bearer of that name. Have any of you ever been in a family where some family member's name is never mentioned, won't be mentioned, can't be mentioned? Because it is almost as though one is cutting off the existence of that person. I love it that when we baptize a child, we always ask at the baptismal font over here, what is the child's name? And you might think that the pastors have a memory problem and you want to, and that they want to be sure to get the name right. No, they ask because they want to emphasize that this is the name that remains with the child for all time. In addition, the child is baptized with 3 other names: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So no matter how long or how short a child's life is, that name of that child is registered in the book of life forever. Well, in the Hebrew scriptures, a given name was the essence of personality, of that person's personality, an expression of one's inner name, innermost being, and even power. And in Genesis 27:36, Esau's describing his brother Jacob. And he says, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" Now, it's pronounced Yaakov, and it means trickster, or very literally, heel grabber. That is because when Jacob and Esau were born as twins, they actually fought in their mother's womb. I have to say, that is a dreadful thought. And because the firstborn son was always given the father's blessing along with enormous privileges, and Esau was delivered first, Jacob was trying to grab Esau's heel so that he could come out first and receive the blessing. Every mother here knows that would not be possible. So from birth on, heel grabber was the name used by Jews to describe any untrustworthy person. So when it comes to the first petition of the Lord's Prayer, hallowed be thy name, or holy be your name, we have to clear away some underbrush. And we have to look at the meaning of holy. And some of you may find that term negative because we associate it with a person whom we say is holier than thou, a person who's imbued with superior moral righteousness and judgment. But I like the Bible Project's definition of holiness, and that is that God is the morally perfect creative force behind the universe, which makes God unique and set apart, but who also is unlike anything else we have experienced in life. God's name is his very being. The God who sometimes seems so far away from us or in the heavens, as well as the God who is as near as our own breath. Well, most of us miss the fact that due to issues of translation, hallowed be thy name, or holy is your name, is actually acting God to act. In fact, to make his name holy in the world so that the whole world may worship and glorify him. The book of Ezekiel is filled with God's active movement in making his name holy. Ezekiel says, quotes God, "And so I will show my greatness and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations, and they will know that I am Lord." Now, friends, you may think that the Lord's Prayer is a Christian prayer, which is understandable because Jesus commanded that we say it. And of course, it is a Christian prayer. But the Lord's Prayer, as it is expressed in Matthew and Luke, is essentially a Jewish prayer that Jesus would have known. Holy is your name is taken directly from a very ancient prayer regularly recited by Jewish people in ancient times as well as today, known as the Kaddish. And we know that Jesus heard this prayer growing up as a boy. The earliest form of the Kaddish went like this, and I'm going to ask you to read it along with me. "Exalted and hallowed be his great name in the world, that he created according to his will. May he cause his kingdom to reign." Thy kingdom come, do you hear it? In other words, the Kaddish is inviting God's future reign to change the world. Thy kingdom come. Honoring God's name is really the supreme objective of all Jews and Christians. And I'm embarrassed to say, very embarrassed, that earlier in my ministry when I was pastoring in Chicago, I had no idea that the Lord's Prayer was a Jewish prayer until I presided at an interfaith wedding. The town where I lived was about 90% Gentile, and the town right next to it was about 90% Jewish. And these interfaith weddings were very common. And the groom was Jewish. The bride was a member of my church. You can imagine that putting together a wedding service like this was not easy. We had to borrow sections from both of the wedding liturgies and sort of combine them together. And I was meeting with the couple and the rabbi, and I kind of got my courage up and said, would it be okay if we recite the Lord's Prayer? And I paused and waited. Of course, he said with a beaming, toothy smile, it's a Jewish prayer. And then when it came time for the wedding, I looked out to those in attendance. On the groom's side, there were the men and young boys in suits and ties wearing yarmulkes or their skull caps on their heads. Some of the women wore headscarves and long skirts. And then on the bride's side, there were the goyim, or the Gentiles. And the men were in their Brooks Brothers suits, subdued, appropriate ties. The young boys in blue jeans and sweatshirts and running shoes, and the women and girls in their fancy party dresses and jewelry. And all of us were there together with our differences, saying the Lord's Prayer. And as I looked out at those two faith groups who had the same God, I had this blessed and visionary experience. And I thought, how could it ever have been that Jews were put to death in the name of God by people who called themselves Christian? How could it be? And now I'm going to tell you a very Jewish story. It's the story of Jacob. It clearly falls under the category of Bible stories that everybody should know. Jacob's brother Esau, whose name literally means hairy or rough, was born first and was covered with red fuzzy hair. Jacob came out grabbing Esau's heel, desperately jockeying for first place. They were not identical twins like Pastor Aaron and his brother Ross, who look so much alike that you have to be sure you know to whom you are speaking if you're sharing a confidence. Be sure you have the right one. Because Ross has told me sometimes people begin to talk and they don't know that he's not Aaron. So these two sons of Isaac and Rebekah were as different as could be. Esau was a skillful hunter and a man of the field, strong, virile, an outdoorsman, generous, impulsive, couldn't defer gratification very well. You'll see what I mean. He was his father Isaac's favorite, but Jacob was his mother's favorite. Do you sense that some trouble is coming? Jacob is a more domestic type who liked being with mom, cooking in the kitchen. When Esau returns from the field with game to present to his father, he's famished and hungry, and he pleads with Jacob for some of the fragrant stew that Jacob is preparing. However, Jacob tricks Esau into selling him his birthright for, if you can believe it, 1 bowl of lentil soup. Years later, Rebekah and Jacob scheme to trick Isaac, who's now blind. They scheme and trick him into giving Jacob the firstborn blessing. Jacob puts on a hairy skin and pretends to be hairy Esau. And Jacob, guess what? Got the blessing. You should know that this birthright blessing included a double portion of the family inheritance, being a leader in the family, and representing the family name. It was a big deal. Esau was livid, and in chapter 27 of Genesis, the text reports that Esau says, I will kill my brother Jacob. In the face of this threat, Jacob flees from home to escape Esau's rage and heads to his mother's brother's house his name was Uncle Laban. Now, the whole story of Jacob and Esau occupies the 25th through the 35th chapters of Genesis. It is long, it's fascinating, and it's complicated and very human. While at Uncle Laban's for about 20 years, Jacob has been systematically stealing Laban's sheep out from under him. It's really quite creative the way he does it. And when he has accumulated an embarrassing amount of wealth, he decides that it is time to leave again before Laban discovers what is going on. So 20 years after leaving Canaan, Jacob resolves to return home to Canaan, the place of his birth. And he and his 2 wives and his 2 concubines, the livestock and the children, all flee in the night to the wilderness. And as Jacob crosses the river Jordan into Canaan, he prays the longest prayer that is found in Genesis, asking God to protect him from Esau's wrath. And he lubricates this prayer with a gift of appeasement for Esau, 380 goats, sheep, donkeys, cows, and camels. Frederick Buechner states, the book of Genesis makes no attempt to conceal the fact that Jacob is a crook. Even though Jacob has not seen Esau in 20 years, he learns that Esau is coming after him with 400 men and is intending to take revenge by killing Jacob. And Jacob sends his animals, servants, wives, concubines, and children towards home. At first, he puts the women and children out in front of him, and then he decides, maybe I better not do that. Good idea, don't you think, women? So there's Jacob, utterly alone on the run, terrified and desperate. And then in the darkest night, near the Jabbok Ford, in terror and loneliness, Jacob encounters a mysterious stranger. Now, I know that many of you may think that the stranger is an angel of God, but nowhere in Genesis does it say angel. It says man. That word angel is used much later in the book of Hosea, the prophet Hosea's hindsight reflection of this event. The way the story is told, there's confusion in this wrestling match and an entanglement of bodies with pushing and pulling and body to body, so much so that it's hard to tell whether they're embracing one another or they're defending themselves. And the text says, when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Daylight is coming, and the blessed intruder says, let me go. And Jacob, the trickster, the deceiver, the heel grabber, always insisting on being blessed, tries to make a deal with the stranger. He says, I will not let you go until you bless me. You see, Jacob was afraid of Esau and his 400 men. He was desperate to know if the promise of God that was given many years earlier was still intact. And the stranger says, what is your name? And Jacob says, I am Jacob. Jacob, trickster, I am Jacob. And there we see an incredibly, incredibly amazing scene. And the man says, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans, and you have overcome. And Jacob said, please tell me your name. And the stranger says, but why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. He blessed him. Pay attention. Pay attention. God does not want to be named, nor be manipulated, nor be connived, nor be fooled, nor will he fulfill Jacob's request to know God's name. And then Jacob knew who the stranger was. We know he knew it because he named the place of this wrestling match Peniel, because he saw God face to face and did not die, as tradition would have suggested. You cannot see God's face and live. The word for God embedded in Peniel is Elohim, and that is the name that is named for God at creation. It is the name for the God of all peoples, all races, all tongues, all colors, not only the God of Abraham and Isaac. Now, there is so much food for thought in this passage, it's almost too much to digest. So what's in a name? Everything. Everything. But now let's ask, why did God not reveal his name? The answer to this is critical. To name something in that ancient world was to exercise control over it. Oh, the pagan religions always named their gods. And in the naming, they tried to appease them with all kinds of methods and manipulation. Because you see, a name gives an opportunity to define God or use God for one's own purposes or to make God in one's own image. You see, a pinned down name for God can eliminate all mystery by assuming that we know the truth with such precision that those who question, doubt, or differ are shut out or regarded as heretics or named the enemy of God or even should be violently eliminated. History proves the point. From the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, witch trials, jihads, Holocausts, Rwanda, Israel, Palestine, or Jim Crow, slavery, fundamentalism in all of its form in every religion, Islamic, Jewish, Christian, all have their roots in absolute certainty about who the enemy is and who is not, who is saved and who is damned, who is superior and who is inferior, and whom is to be conquered. And all of it becomes a rationale for violence. And here's the very root of our human problem. We humans always don't like difference. And we don't like crossing the line of difference. If you've ever been wrestling with God all of your life, this is your story. This is your story. God is still the blessed intruder who comes to us when life pushes us to the edge of our capacity. And it may be in the trenches of war, in the hospital, at the graveyard, in the job loss, in the doctor's report, or the relationship failure, or separation. God meets you there just as God met Jacob, because God will never let you go. All humans have moments when they want to escape God. We have a lot of people who want to escape God. They even argue convincingly for the non-existence of God and feel that they live pretty well without God. But there's no escape. And sooner or later, God's hand will fall upon us as it fell upon Jacob. And God will risk pain, suffering, and even death on the cross in order to have an intimate relationship with you. It costs God a lot to have an intimate relationship with you. And now we come to the last act of this incredible drama and the final question being asked of us before the curtain falls. What is God asking of us? How do we honor God's holy name? And the answer to that is found in, I think, in chapter 33. There's Jacob. He looks up and he sees Esau with his 400 men, and they're coming his way. And there, with the pain in his hip, he approaches Esau, bows down low to the ground before him 7 times as he approaches his brother. Bowing down in ancient Israel was what people who were inferior did with people who were superior. Imagine this Jacob. Now you know about him. This Jacob. Bowing down, lowering himself. But even more astonishing is Esau. Esau, who's been betrayed, who with tears falling on his face, kisses, puts his head down on the neck of Jacob and embraces him. There are 2 separate astonishing transformations going on here. James Kimmel is a lawyer who's a lecturer in psychiatry at Yale Medical School and the author of a forthcoming book called The Science of Revenge. It does a deep dive into the addictive nature of revenge and also its evolutionary function. Research has discovered that when one has been wronged, as Esau was wronged, it is so painful that the brain will seek a compensating experience of pleasure. Now, it may be alcohol or it may be pot or something like that, but it is often in the form of revenge. And that revenge is very pleasurable when it's being carried out. It actually produces endorphins. Very addictive, but like all other addictions, it's short-lived. And even after revenge has been carried out, pain sets back in and revenge is sought again. Revenge is just one of the many destructive human appetites and addictions that I believe can only be overcome by our love for God in Jesus, that compels us to do as He asked, an act of obedience, namely to love our enemies, to turn the other cheek. What Esau did is nothing short of a miracle, but he wasn't the same man anymore. He forgave Jacob for his deception and the damage, and the other miracle was the transformation that took place in Jacob following this direct encounter with God. If someone asked me, what does God want from His people? I would say it's found in this amazing statement from Jacob to Esau in Genesis 33:10. To see your face is like seeing the face of God. In every human face, there is a trace. Sometimes it's great, and sometimes it's very small. there is a trace of the divine face, for we have been made in his image. To see the face of God in every human is the antithesis of narcissism as well as its antidote. In the whole history of humankind, with heart-sickening consistency, violence is met with violence. Revenge is met after being hurt. Wrongdoing is met with punishment. And revenge is so often the rule that we mistakenly call it justice. An eye for an eye. You see, as Jesus taught us in the Sermon on the Mount, God is asking us to love our enemies, of those who just don't like us, who we don't like, rather, because they are different. But those who do not look like us or act like us are sacred siblings in God's family. And it's very hard, I know, to work out, to live with differences, whether it's in our marriages or our national life. It's easier to simply talk about God, but not obey what Jesus commanded of us. You know, this love of enemy in the Sermon on the Mount, I think, is the genius and validity of the Christian faith. It's easier to make God in our image than it is to accept the holiness and otherness of God. Each one of us can contribute to the holiness of God by seeing his face in every face we encounter. Remember what Aaron taught us last week when he quoted that African greeting? I see you, I see you. And the response is, who remembers? Here I am. Here I am. I believe that if we could see the face of God like Jacob did, we too could look at every person and say, when I see you, I see the face of God. Let's pray. O God, Yahweh, Elohim, El Shaddai, holy is your name. Holy is your name. You're not in the whirlwind and rituals and ecclesiastical or national ambitions. You are everywhere, in every nation, and yet you are here where we are, which of course is why you are sometimes hard to find. But you are here with us, caring and forgiving until we are reconciled. May we make your name holy by honoring all people and your Son, Jesus Christ, who told us to love our enemy and stop the cycle of revenge. May it be in Jesus' name. Amen.